Chapter 3 Through the Desert and Loneliness. After meeting Pride, Much Afraid's poor crooked feet hurt her even more, and the journey to the high places was slow and painful. As time went on, she still held on tightly to her two helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, and gradually they began to make better progress. Then one day the path turned a corner, and to Much Afraid's great surprise, she saw a desert in front of them. As far as the eye could see, there was only bare, sandy land, except for the pyramids rising above the sand dunes. Pyramids are buildings that look like enormous triangles and are made from stone bricks. Sorrow and Suffering started to take her on a steep path leading down toward the desert, but Much Afraid stopped firmly. "We mustn't go down there. The shepherd has called me to the high places." Still, they showed her she was to follow them down the steep pathway. Much Afraid looked to the left and then to the right, but there was no other path. All around them were rocky cliffs as straight as walls. "I can't go down there," she cried with fear. "He called me up to the high places, not to an empty desert." She lifted her voice and called loudly, "Shepherd, come to me. I need you. Come and help me." In a moment he was there, standing beside her. "Shepherd, I can't understand this. The helpers you gave me are trying to lead me toward that desert, turning right away from the high places. Make a way for us, Shepherd, as you promised." He answered her very gently. "That is the path, Much Afraid, and you are to go down there." "Oh, no," she cried. "You can't mean it. You promised to take me to the high places." "Much Afraid, do you love me enough to trust me? Will you go down there with me even though the path seems to lead you away from what I have promised?" She sank to her knees at his feet, sobbing as if her heart would break. "I do love you. You know I do. Oh, forgive me because I can't help crying. I will go with you into the wilderness. I will trust you to choose for me what is best." So there Much Afraid built her first altar, a little pile of broken rocks. With the shepherd standing close beside her, she laid down on the altar her very own desires. A little spurt of flame came from somewhere, and then there was nothing but a heap of ashes. That is, at first she thought there was nothing. The shepherd took her to look closer, and there among the ashes was a little stone. "Pick it up and take it with you," said the shepherd, "to remember this altar that you built and all that it stands for." He handed her a little bag. Much Afraid picked up the stone from the ashes, dropped it into the little bag, and put it away carefully. Much to her delighted surprise, the shepherd walked with them down into the desert. He began to sing a song from the great book, and Much Afraid felt her pain begin to melt away. They reached the desert quickly because Much Afraid leaned on the shepherd. By evening, they were at one of the great pyramids. At its base were some little huts where they would spend the night. At sunset, when the sky burned fiery red over the western side of the desert, the shepherd led Much Afraid away from the huts to the foot of the pyramid. "Much Afraid," he said, "all of my servants had to pass through the desert on their way to the high places. Here they have learned many things which they could never have learned in any other place." Suddenly the desert was full of people, like an endless parade. Some of them Much Afraid knew from reading their stories in the great book. There was Abraham and Sarah, his wife. They had been strangers in a strange land. Then there was Joseph, whose brothers had turned against him. One after another, the crowd of people stretched across the desert. The last one in line held out his hand to her, and Much Afraid joined those faithful servants who had walked through the wilderness. After this, the shepherd took her back to the huts to rest for the night. In the morning, the shepherd called Much Afraid again. He led her to a little door in the wall of the pyramid and took her inside. There was a hallway that led to the center, and from there, a spiral staircase went to the floors above. But the shepherd opened another door on the ground floor, and they went into a large room. Piles of grain were everywhere except in the middle. There in the open space, men were threshing the grain. Much Afraid watched how the grains were first beaten until they crumbled to pieces. Then they were beaten with stones until they became the finest flour. "It is the same with my people," the shepherd said gently. "They too must be threshed and ground into the finest powder so they can become like bread for others. It is a painful process." After this, the shepherd took her back to the central room, and they climbed the spiral staircase. There, on the second floor, was another smaller room. In the center was a man making pottery. He was working with the soft clay upon a potter's wheel, making a beautiful bowl. As they watched, the shepherd said, "I work with people as though they are clay. I mold and shape them to be like beautiful vessels. I want to do that with you, Much Afraid. I want you to be as clay in my hands." Last of all, he took her up the stairway to the highest floor. There they found a room with a furnace in which gold was being refined. The gold was heated until it was very, very hot. Everything inside the gold that was not good floated to the top and was removed, so all that was left was pure gold. As Much Afraid stood fearfully looking at the fire, the shepherd smiled and said, "My rarest jewels and my finest gold are those who have gone through the fire." Then he took her hand in his and continued, "So don't be surprised when you are tested by a fiery trial. Rejoice and be happy." Rejoice and be happy? The words echoed in her mind as Much Afraid walked back down the staircase, still holding the shepherd's hand. Then she remembered some other words she had read once in the great book. "He knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as pure gold." The words were comforting, and she spoke them over and over in her heart. They stayed in the desert huts for several days. Time was spent resting and restocking their supply of food and water. On the last morning, Much Afraid made a lovely discovery as she went for a walk. Behind one of the huts was an old pipe connected to a water tank. In the pipe was a tiny hole from which drops of water fell one by one. At the place where they landed was the first growing thing she had seen in the desert. It was a beautiful little golden flower. Much Afraid knelt close to it and asked softly, "What is your name, lovely flower?" The tiny plant seemed to answer at once with a voice as golden as itself. "I am Acceptance with Joy." Much Afraid thought of the things she had seen in the pyramid, the threshing floor, the potter's wheel, and the fiery furnace. The words of the little golden flower echoed in her mind, and she said to herself, "I too want to be Acceptance with Joy. Whatever he lets me go through, I want to trust him and allow him to have his way with my life. And I want to do it with joy in my heart." Then she stooped down and picked up a pebble that was lying in the sand beside the flower and put it into her little bag with the first altar stone. Much Afraid and the shepherd, together with Suffering and Sorrow, kept walking through the desert. Then one day, quite suddenly, they came to a path. "This," said the shepherd quietly, "is the way you are to go." So they turned and after a while found themselves on the shore of a great sea. "It is time for me to leave you, Much Afraid," he said, "and return to the mountains. Even though you seem further away than ever from the high places, I will still come to you quickly if you call me." He then went leaping and bounding across the desert toward the mountains which were far behind them. Much Afraid and her two helpers walked along the shores of the great sea for many days. She began to know the name of the places where she presently journeyed. This place was called Loneliness. Now the mountains were out of sight, and her home in the valley was far, far away. There seemed to be nothing in the whole world except for the desert on one side and the endless, dreary sea on the other. Often an icy wind would blow, and the only sound was the lonely crying of seagulls overhead. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her two helpers. It was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. It was also amazing how she walked now with hardly a limp. Somehow, something had happened to her in the desert. She was learning to accept with joy the path the shepherd had for her. Although she went with sorrow and suffering day after day beside the sea of loneliness, Much Afraid felt a happiness in her heart. She even began to realize that the place was strangely beautiful. She spoke words to herself that she had read in the great book. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Meanwhile, far away in the valley, her fearing relatives had been waiting for Pride to come back with Much Afraid. As time passed, they realized he must not have been able to make her turn around and was now too proud to come back and admit that he had failed. They decided they had to send others to help him before Much Afraid reached the high places and was forever out of their reach. Spies were sent out to find Pride, and they brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere near the mountains, but far away on the shores of loneliness. This made her relatives very excited. They quickly agreed on who should go and help Pride bring Much Afraid back to them. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity left right away. Those were the three characters who joined Pride. Off they went to the shores of loneliness. However, her enemies soon discovered that this was not the same Much Afraid they used to know. They could not get close to her because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering. All they could do was call out to her. "I told you so," Pride shouted. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Ha! He's gone and left you, just like I said he would." Resentment raised his ugly head over a rock. "Who is this shepherd that you follow? Why do you let him treat you like this? He promised to take you to the high places, and here you are next to the desert." Then bitterness sneered out from behind another rock. "The more you let him, the more he will keep doing cruel things to you. You had better turn around and leave him now before he asks even more of you." Self-pity was almost worse than the others. He spoke so softly and in such a whimpering voice that Much Afraid felt weak all over. "Poor little Much Afraid," he whispered. "You have every right to feel sorry for yourself. You have been so willing and so obedient, but he keeps thinking up some new ways to hurt you and cause you such pain." This last remark was a mistake. The word pain suddenly reminded Much Afraid of the lessons she had learned in the pyramid. The threshing floor, the potter's wheel, the fiery furnace, all would cause pain, but it was necessary if she wanted to be changed into what the shepherd wanted her to be. When she thought of this, to self-pity's shock, she picked up a piece of rock and threw it at him with all her might. But she became more and more tired of listening to the voices of her enemies. She couldn't hold her ears because sorrow and suffering were holding her hands. It was getting harder to resist their whining, and she was getting weaker. Finally, Much Afraid had enough. "Shepherd," she called. "Come and help me. Hurry." To the horror of her enemies, there was the shepherd leaping toward them. Immediately, they ran in different directions, trying to escape. "Oh, shepherd, thank you. I didn't call you sooner because I thought I could get rid of them myself. Why couldn't I do it?" "I think," said the shepherd gently, "that lately you were beginning to tell yourself that it was time I led you back toward the mountains and the high places. Perhaps you have been impatient instead of acceptance with joy. Perhaps you liked what they said." Much Afraid felt her cheeks getting hot. The shepherd was right. She put her hand into his. "I have been thinking that you have led me on this path too long and that you had forgotten your promises. I'm sorry. You are my shepherd. I will trust you and follow where you lead." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone which was lying beside her feet. He smiled and said, "Put this in your bag with the other stones. It will help you remember your promise to wait patiently until I do what I have said I would do." Much afraid, and her helpers walked for many, many days along the shores of loneliness. Pride, resentment, bitterness, and self-pity kept attacking her, but Much Afraid was getting stronger. She kept remembering to accept the path with joy, no matter what, and to trust the shepherd. Finally, they arrived at a different place. It was a lovely country filled with the fruit trees and hills. Everywhere she looked, there were singing birds and blossoming flowers. She felt as though she had stepped out of winter and into spring. In a short while, they came to the edge of some trees, and Much Afraid gave a little cry of joy. There was the shepherd, waiting to meet them. She ran toward him as though she had wings on her feet. "Oh, welcome, welcome, 1,000 times welcome," she cried, throwing herself into his big, strong arms. "I have come to bring you a message," said the shepherd, as he held her. "It is time for you to see what I will do." "Oh, shepherd," she cried as she pulled away from him a bit and looked into his eyes, "do you mean that I am finally going to the high places?" She thought he nodded, but he didn't answer her. He just stood looking at her with a soft sort of smile. "Do you mean it?" she asked. "Do you mean that soon you will be taking me to the high places?" This time he answered, "Yes," and added with a strange smile, "Now you will see what I will do." He held her for another moment before leaving them, and Much Afraid felt as though strength was pouring into her. Much Afraid had a song in her heart as she walked among the fields and trees of that country. She continued on her happy journey for some time. One day they reached the top of one of the hills just as the sun was rising. There, not far away, were the mountains. Much Afraid thought she had never seen anything so beautiful. Finally, after such a long time, the path that Much Afraid and her two helpers traveled had turned toward the high places. Much Afraid fell on her knees and worshipped. It seemed to her that moment that all the pain and all the troubles had been worthwhile. It seemed to her also that even sorrow and suffering were smiling with her. Then Much Afraid realized something else. She was beginning to understand the language spoken by these two sisters. She remembered what the shepherd had told her when she first met sorrow and suffering. As you travel with them, little by little, you will learn to understand their words. As she rose to her feet, Much Afraid took their hands in hers, and the three travelers started their journey once again.